There's a name you've never heard. Not because it's hidden, not because it's classified, but because the world, quietly, naturally, the way the world usually does these things, just moved on. This man built the model behind Costco. Sam Walton read about him, flew across the country to watch him work, went home and copied everything he saw. Jeff Bezos studied him before building Amazon Prime. The founder of Home Depot said he owed his career to him. 4 companies combined worth more than $4 trillion. And you've never heard his name. That's not an accident. That's a pattern. And once you see it, once you understand how it works and why it keeps happening, you'll never look at a success story the same way again. His name was Saul Price. And this is the story of what he built, who stole it, and who finally understood it. Let me tell you something about Saul Price before we go any further. He wasn't a retail guy. He didn't grow up dreaming about warehouses or membership fees. He was a lawyer. A labor lawyer. The kind who spent his days representing workers being squeezed by the companies they worked for. He grew up in New York, son of Jewish immigrants, came of age during the Depression, and watched what poverty actually looks like when it gets close enough to touch. That matters, because everything Saul Price ever built came from that place. From watching people get taken advantage of, from understanding at a bone-deep level that most businesses aren't built to serve the people they sell to. They're built to extract from them. Quietly, efficiently, with a smile. Saul never forgot that. In 1954, he opened a store in San Diego called FedMart. And right away, he did something almost no one in American retail was doing at the time. He capped his markup. Not as a promotional tactic, not as a quarterly strategy, as a permanent, non-negotiable operating principle. He committed, unconditionally, that FedMart would never mark up a product more than a fixed percentage above wholesale cost. No matter how much demand there was, no matter what the market would bear. If he could buy something for $10 and sell it for $20, he didn't. He sold it for $11. Sit with that for a second. In a world where the entire logic of business is to charge as much as you possibly can, this is a radical act. This is someone saying, I know what this is worth to you, and I'm going to give it to you for less. Not because I'm weak, because I've decided that's who I am. That philosophy had a name. Saul called it. And I love this. Intelligent loss of sales. The idea was simple. If a customer comes in wanting something that isn't right for them, you tell them the truth. You send them somewhere else. You let the sale go, because the customer who leaves knowing you told them the truth, even when it cost you, comes back. And when they come back, they bring someone with them. Most businessmen hear that and think, nice idea. Doesn't scale, can't survive in the real world. Saul Price spent the next 5 decades proving them wrong. FedMart grew slowly, then steadily. And somewhere along the way, a young kid from Pittsburgh got a job there as a bag boy. 18 years old. No business degree, no connections. Just a kid who showed up, paid attention, and for reasons Saul Price himself probably couldn't fully explain, ended up staying for the next 25 years. That kid's name was Jim Sinegal. But we'll get to him. Because before we understand what Sinegal inherited, we need to understand what happened to FedMart. Saul Price built something real, and the people who owned it eventually decided they wanted something different. The store was sold. Saul was pushed out. By 1975, he was 59 years old. No longer running the company he had spent 2 decades building. Sitting with an idea that had worked, that he knew had worked, but that nobody around him seemed to care about anymore. Some people would have called it a career. Saul Price wasn't some people. In 1976, he and his son, Robert, took what they had and opened a single warehouse in a converted airplane hangar in San Diego. No shelves, pallets on a concrete floor, fluorescent lights. No exterior signage that would mean anything to someone driving by. He called it the Price Club. And with that, with a few pallets of parking lot and a philosophy the rest of the industry had already dismissed, Saul Price started building something that would eventually be worth more than $4 trillion. He just wouldn't be the one who got the credit. The Price Club didn't look like a revolution. That was part of the point. You walked in and there were no signs telling you what to feel. No music engineered to slow your pace. No end caps designed to make you reach for something you didn't come in for. There was a concrete floor, a high ceiling, and pallets of products stacked higher than most people could see. The lighting was industrial. The presentation was almost aggressively indifferent to aesthetics, and people loved it. Not immediately. The first 2 years, the Price Club lost money. Saul knew it would. He wasn't building a store, he was building a relationship, and relationships take time before they pay back. But then something shifted. Word got out. Not through advertising, because Saul didn't advertise, but through something older and more reliable than any campaign. People told other people, not because they were asked to, because they'd found something that felt different from every other place they'd ever shopped. And when you find something like that, you want the people you care about to know. By the early 1980s, the Price Club had become one of the most quietly studied business models in America. Quietly. Because Saul Price wasn't interested in attention. He was building a system, and systems, real ones, don't need to announce themselves. They just work. Here's where the story turns. In 1983, a man named Sam Walton flew to San Diego. Sam Walton was already the most successful retailer in American history. Walmart was everywhere. And yet, he was worried. Not about today, about tomorrow. He built the largest discount retail chain in the world. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he sensed it had a ceiling. That something was happening in that warehouse in San Diego that he hadn't figured out yet. So he flew out there, walked the floor, watched the people shop, observed the membership desk, the food court, the pallets, the limited selection. He took notes. Sam Walton was famous for this. He kept a little notepad everywhere he went, walked competitors' stores like an anthropologist, wrote down everything he saw. Then he flew back to Bentonville, and he built Sam's Club. He later wrote about it in his autobiography with a directness you have to respect, even as it stings. He didn't hide it. He just said it. I've stolen as many ideas from Saul Price as from anybody else in the business. Stolen his word. I want you to notice something about that sentence, not just the confession. That's remarkable on its own. But the framing, as many ideas as from anybody else.
Meaning, copying was, for Sam Walton, a strategy, a discipline, something he was proud of. He saw it as efficiency. Why invent what someone else already figured out? It's a reasonable philosophy in a lot of contexts. It works. But here's what Sam Walton missed. And this is the thing that the next 40 years would slowly, quietly prove. You can copy what a person does. You cannot copy why they do it. Sam Walton walked through Price Club and saw a form at the warehouse. The bulk quantities, the limited SKU count, the membership fee. He saw the mechanics. He took his notes, went home, and reproduced it with the operational precision only the world's largest retailer can deploy. What he didn't take notes on, what wasn't visible, what didn't fit in a notepad, was the conversation Saul Price was having with himself every single day. The decision, made again and again, to leave money on the table because leaving money on the table was the right thing to do. Sam's Club opened in 1983. Costco opened in 1983. Same year, same Model 1 built by a man who had absorbed the philosophy over 25 years. One built by a man who had walked through a warehouse and taken very good notes. The distance between those two things, between absorbing and observing, between understanding and recording, is not visible from the outside. Not at first. It takes years before it shows up in the numbers, before the gap becomes impossible to explain away. And when it does, everyone agrees it's a story about execution or timing or maybe just luck. Very few people ask the right question, which is, what exactly did Sam Walton see? And what did he walk right past without ever knowing it was there?
Jim Sinegal was 18 years old when he first walked into a FedMart store. He needed a job. He got one bag in groceries. The kind of work that pays just enough to remind you that you need something better. But not so bad that you leave before figuring out what better actually looks like. What kept Sinegal? That wasn't the paycheck. It was the man running the place. Saul Price had a way of operating that Sinegal had never seen before. Saul didn't manage from a corner office. He was on the floor. He was in the conversations. He knew the names of his employees, not as a management technique, but because he actually cared. Because the people who worked for him were part of the same covenant as the people who shopped there. That word, covenant, matters. Because what Saul Price built wasn't a business strategy. It was closer to a set of promises to his employees, to his customers, to himself. And those promises weren't written in a handbook. They were visible in every decision he made, every day, in full view of anyone paying attention. Sinegal was paying attention. For 25 years, he watched Saul Price make decisions that other businessmen would never make. He watched him refuse to raise prices when demand spiked. He watched him fire buyers who accepted gifts from suppliers, not because it was illegal, but because it created a conflict of interest that would eventually cost the customer. He watched him walk away from profitable product lines because the quality wasn't good enough. Not good enough for whom? For the member. Always for the member. And somewhere in those 25 years, not in a single moment, but through accumulation, Sinegal stopped learning how Saul Price ran a business and started understanding why. That's a different kind of knowledge. You can teach someone how you cannot teach someone why. Why lives in the bones. It gets there through years of watching the same person make the same kind of decision, until the pattern becomes instinct and the principle becomes reflex. When Sinegal left to start Costco in 1983, he didn't just know the model. He was the model.
The first Costco opened in Seattle on September 15, 1983. A warehouse, pallets, concrete floors, a membership fee of $25. A markup cap that mirrored Saul prices almost exactly, and a food court with a hot dog and a soda for $1.50. That last detail seems small. It isn't. The hot dog, $1.50 since 1985, became something far larger than a lunch option over the years. Became a declaration, a way of saying, we know what this cost us. We know what the market would let us charge. And we are choosing, every single year, not to change it. Because some things are not about margin. Some things are about trust. And trust, once broken, cost more to rebuild than any price increase ever saved. When Craig Jelinek, who eventually succeeded Sinegal as CEO, suggested raising the price of the hot dog, Sinegal's response was immediate. If you raise the price of that hot dog, I will kill you. Figure it out. Figure it out. Not, here's why that's a bad idea. Not, let me walk you through the implications. Just, this is not negotiable. Find another way. That's what inherited philosophy looks like in practice. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't justify itself. It just holds. And here's what's remarkable. What the numbers eventually confirmed beyond any argument. That refusal to optimize built something that a company with 3 times the resources and the full operational weight of the world's largest retailer could never replicate. Costco today has 81 million paying members. 92.3% renew every year. Not because they have to, because they don't want to leave. Sam Walton got the notepad. He never got the bones.
By 1992, there were 2 warehouse clubs that mattered in America. Price Club. So Price's original 16 years of quiet, disciplined operation. The place where the idea had been born, tested, and proven. And Costco. Jim Sinegal's company. Built by the man who had spent 25 years absorbing every principle, every refusal, every decision made in the name of something larger than quarterly profit. They weren't competitors in the traditional sense. They were more like 2 branches of the same tree, shaped by the same roots, growing in slightly different directions, occasionally casting shadows on each other, without either one wanting a fight. But the market was getting crowded. Sam's Club was expanding aggressively. The economics of the model were starting to pressure both companies simultaneously. So conversations began. Price Club and Costco would merge. On paper, it made perfect sense. Combined, they would have over 200 warehouses, 18 million members, and a scale that would make them untouchable. The terms gave Costco a slight majority. 52% to 48%. Jim Sinegal would be CEO. Robert Price, Saul's son, who had been running Price Club alongside his father, would become chairman. For 14 months, it worked, or appeared to. Because here's what was actually happening inside that boardroom. 2 fundamentally different visions of the same inheritance were trying to occupy the same space. And that never works. Not forever. Not when both visions are held by people who genuinely believe they are the rightful continuation of what came before. Robert Price believed, not unreasonably,
that he was the natural heir to his father's legacy. He had grown up inside the Price Club. He had watched Saul build it. He carried his father's name, his father's values, his father's memory in the way only a son can carry a father. Jim Sinegal believed, also not unreasonably, that he had spent 25 years becoming the living embodiment of everything Saul Price stood for. That philosophy wasn't inherited through blood. It was earned through presence, through the long, slow work of watching a principled man make principled decisions until those principles become your own. Both of them were right. And that's precisely why it couldn't last. In December of 1994, Robert Price left. The formal reasons were professional incompatible visions, disagreements about strategy, the kind of language corporate announcements use when the real story is too human, too painful to put in a press release. What Robert took with him was significant. International development rights for several markets, 4 warehouse locations, real estate assets, the legal foundation for what would become PriceSmart, a company he built and has run for over 30 years across 12 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean.
PriceSmart is, in many ways, the most faithful continuation of Saul Price's original vision. Lean principled, built for markets where fair pricing is not a luxury proposition, but a genuine lifeline. Robert Price has spent 3 decades building that quietly, exactly the way his father would have. It generates about $4 billion in annual revenue. Costco generates $270 billion. I'm not telling you this to suggest Robert failed. I think he built something real, something his father would have recognized and respected. But the arithmetic of legacy is brutal, and it doesn't care about intention. What happened next was almost inevitable. The merged company, called Price Costco, quietly dropped the first word. In 1997, it became Costco Wholesale Corporation. The name Price disappeared from American retail entirely. Saul Price, the man who invented the model, built FedMart from nothing, conceived the Price Club, and trained the man who built the most successful warehouse retailer in history, had his name removed from the thing he had spent his life creating. Not out of malice, no conspiracy, no deliberate erasure, just the natural momentum of growth, the way large institutions outgrow the names of the people who started them, the way the present buries the past simply by continuing to move forward. But here's what stays with me. Saul Price died in 2009, 93 years old. He spent his final years in San Diego, quietly, the way he had always operated. He gave money away. He stayed connected to the community he had always cared about. He watched, from a distance, as the model he had built continued to grow, rebranded, renamed, attributed to others, into something far larger than he had imagined. He never complained publicly, never demanded credit, never wrote the memoir that would have reclaimed his place in the story. I keep thinking about that, about what it takes to build something that outlives your name, about whether that's a tragedy or a kind of rare integrity. I don't know the answer, but I think it's the right question. Let's talk about the numbers. Because eventually, every story like this one arrives at the numbers. And the numbers here are so clean, so unambiguous, so difficult to explain away. They almost feel like a verdict. Costco fiscal year 2025, $269 billion in revenue, 81 million paying members. A renewal rate of 92.3%. A private label, Kirkland signature. Generating $90 billion a year on its own. More than Nike, more than Coca-Cola. A brand with no advertising budget, no celebrity endorsements, no standalone stores. Just a name on a label, and 30 years of never disappointing the person who picked it up. Sam's Club, same fiscal year, $93 billion, 600 locations, renewal rate estimated between 78 and 83%. Same model, same year of founding, one earns 3 times more. One keeps nearly 1 in 5 members walking away every single year. Now, if you believe business outcomes are primarily explained by execution, by operational efficiency, supply chain management, the quality of the leadership team, then this gap should be closable. Walmart has more resources than any company in the history of retail. If the gap were about investment or technology or talent, Sam's Club should have closed it decades ago. It hasn't. It isn't closing. So what is actually going on? Here is my answer, and I want to give it slowly, because it deserves that. When Saul Price built the Price Club, he did something almost no business builder ever does. He built a company around a constraint, not a product, not a market opportunity, a constraint. The constraint was this: we will never charge more than 14% above wholesale cost ever. That sounds simple. It isn't, because that single and flexible line changes every other decision in the company. It changes what you buy and how much. It changes how you negotiate with suppliers. It changes how you think about labor costs and advertising, which, notably, is essentially zero. If you're operating on a 14% markup cap, you cannot afford to advertise. You have to earn loyalty, the only way that actually works, by being worth returning to. The constraint creates the culture. The culture creates the trust. The trust creates the renewal rate. And the renewal rate generates a membership fee base that accounts for 51.3% of Costco's total operating income. Pure recurring, almost entirely detached from product margin volatility. That's the whole machine. And here's what makes it impossible to copy. The constraint only works if it's absolute. The moment someone in a boardroom says, "We'll hold the line everywhere except this category, this quarter," the machine begins to degrade. Not immediately, not visibly. But trust erodes one small compromise at a time, until the renewal rate tells you what the income statement couldn't. Sam's Club introduced exceptions, not because the people running it were careless, but because they operated inside a structure that answers to Walmart's shareholders. And Walmart's shareholders don't share. Saul Price's theology about what a business owes the people it serves. There's a moment from 2009 I keep returning to. That year, Costco had a pricing dispute with Coca-Cola. Costco believed Coke was asking for more than the product warranted. So Costco pulled every Coca-Cola product from every shelf in every store in the country. Put up signs explaining to members exactly what was happening. Said plainly, "We cannot offer you the value you deserve on this product right now. So we're not offering it at all." Think about that. One of the most consumed beverages on earth removed entirely in favor of an honest note. Most companies would have negotiated quietly, kept the product on the shelf, preserved the supplier relationship. Costco decided the relationship worth preserving was the one with the member. That decision traces directly back to Saul Price.
to a man who believed that intelligent loss of sales was not weakness, that saying, "We won't sell you this right now because it isn't worth what we'd have to charge," was the highest form of retail, the thing that made membership mean something. Sam Walton never understood that. He saw a hot dog, a pallet, a membership desk, a concrete floor. He saw all of it and missed everything.
I want to pause here for a second. Not because the story is over. It isn't. But if you've made it this far, if you stayed through the history, through the numbers, through the quiet tragedy of a name being slowly removed from the thing it built, then I think you already understand something most people never stop long enough to notice. And that's exactly the kind of person I made this channel for. If something in this video is landing, if this story is making you think differently about how credit gets assigned, about what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, hit subscribe. Not for the algorithm, because we're going to keep making videos exactly like this one. Stories about the people behind the institutions, the architects behind the empires, the names that got erased so that other names could be celebrated. That's what this channel is. Now back to salt price, because there's one more layer I haven't shown you yet. His erasure is not unique. That's what makes it worth understanding. The history of business has a very consistent pattern when it comes to originators and operators. Between the person who conceived the idea and the person who scaled it. And the pattern goes like this. The scaler wins almost every time. Not because they did more, but because scale is visible and vision is not. Because you can measure revenue and you cannot measure the courage it takes to hold a principle when holding it is expensive. Think about what Salt Price actually did. He spent 20 years at FedMart proving that a business could be built on genuine service rather than extraction. He got pushed out. He started over at 59. He built the Price Club from a converted airplane hangar, lost money for 2 years and kept going. Because he understood something about time that most people in business don't. That trust accumulates slowly and compounds quietly, and the businesses willing to wait for that accumulation are the ones that eventually become impossible to compete with. He was right, completely, empirically, measurably right, and then the company that proved he was right removed his name from the door. This is not a story about ingratitude. It's something more ordinary, and in some ways more troubling. It's how institutions relate to the people who built them. Once a company reaches a certain scale, it develops its own gravity, its own mythology, and that mythology centers on the people present at the moment of greatest growth, not the people who made that growth possible. Jim Sinegal is celebrated because he held Salt Price's philosophy intact for 30 years under enormous pressure. He deserves that. But Sinegal himself never pretended to be the origin. He said it clearly. Everything he knew, he learned from Salt Price. The credit, in his mind, always pointed backward. The world, however, points forward. We are trained to follow the visible, to track the growth curve, to identify the person at the top of the org chart, the moment of maximum value, and call them the architect. We're not trained to trace the root system, to ask, who taught this person? How far back does the actual idea go? And who, along the way, made the decisive choices that made everything else possible? Salt Price made those choices in 1954, when he capped his margin in 1976, when he started over in a warehouse at 59. Every time he chose the member over the margin, every time he let a sale go because it was the honest thing to do, every time he held the principle with no short-term justification other than the long-term trust it was slowly building.
Those choices are the foundation of a $270 billion company, made by a man most people have never heard of.
Saul Price was born in 1916. He died in 2009. In between those two dates, he built 4 companies, trained the people who built 5 more, conceived a model that today moves more than $4 trillion annually across the global economy. Gave away large portions of what he earned, spent his final decades in the same city where he had started. Never wrote a memoir, never went on a speaking tour, never sat down with a journalist to explain on the record exactly what he had done and why it had worked and who had taken it without saying thank you. He just built things and then he let them go. I've been sitting with this story for a long time, and what I keep returning to is not the injustice of the erasure, though there is something uncomfortable about it. It's not the irony of Sam Walton's confession, though there's something almost too clean about a man who built a $93 billion imitation writing openly that he stole the idea. What I keep returning to is something quieter than that. There is a version of this story where Saul Price is the tragedy, where the man who built the original gets displaced by the copy, where his name disappears, where his son loses the inheritance to a philosophical stranger, where he dies without a museum, without a monument, without a business school bearing his name. That version is true. And there is another version, not more comfortable, but more honest, where Saul Price built exactly what he intended to build, where the point was never the credit, where a man who grew up watching people get taken advantage of decided, at some point in his life, that he was going to spend his years doing the opposite, building something that served rather than extracted, and that he was going to hold that line, not for recognition, not for legacy, but because it was right. And then he did it. For 50 years. Costco today runs the same markup cap. Saul Price set in 1954. The hot dog still cost $1.50. The membership fee exists not as a profit mechanism, but as a covenant, a mutual agreement between the company and the person who hands over $65 and says, "I trust you to make this worth it." And 92.3% of the time, that trust is honored. Every year renewed, not by contract, by choice. That is Saul Price's architecture, still standing, still functioning, still delivering on a promise made by a man most of its members have never heard of. Sam Walton's copy generates $93 billion a year. The original generates $270 billion. At some point, the gap stops being a business story. It becomes something else. I'm not going to tell you what that something else is. I think you already know. I think that's why you're still here. Not because the numbers are interesting, though they are, but because something in this story touched something you recognize. Something about the distance between doing the work and getting credit for it. Between building something real and watching something louder take the room. Between holding a principle when it's costly
and watching someone else profit from a version of that principle, with all the inconvenient parts removed. You know that distance? Most people who do real work know it. Saul Price knew it too, and he kept building anyway.
There's nothing elegant about being forgotten. I want to be honest about that before we close. We spent this whole video talking about Saul Price with a kind of quiet admiration, and that admiration is earned. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that erasure is noble, that being forgotten is somehow the price of building something real, that the world's indifference to the people who originate things is just the natural order, and we should make peace with it. I don't believe that. What I believe is simpler and harder. The people who build the foundations rarely get to live in the house. That's not a law of nature. It's a pattern we've chosen not to interrupt, because interrupting it would require us to slow down, trace backward, ask inconvenient questions about who actually started something before we celebrate who finished it. And we are not, as a culture, trained to do that. We are trained to celebrate arrival, not the road, not the person who built the road, not the person who decided decades before anyone was watching what the road should be made of. Saul Price decided that in 1954, Jim Sinegal walked that road for 50 years. Sam Walton tried to build a parallel road from memory and a notepad. And today, one of those roads moves $270 billion a year. One moves 93 billion. And the man who drew the original map has been reduced to a footnote in an industry that runs entirely on his design. I keep thinking about what Saul Price would make of all this. Not the numbers. I think he would have found the numbers beside the point. But the membership renewal rate, 92.3%. Nearly 9 out of every 10 people who walk through a Costco door, year after year, deciding without being asked, without being reminded, without a loyalty program, or a point system, or a marketing campaign, deciding that it's worth it, that the trust has been kept. I think he would have recognized that. I think that's the thing he spent his life trying to build. Not a company, not a brand, not a valuation. A relationship between a business and the people it serves, built on the radical proposition that if you treat people fairly, consistently, without exception, they will not leave. He was right. He is still right. Every year. 92.3% of the time. If this video meant something to you, if some part of this story is going to stay with you past today, I want to ask one thing. Send it to 5 people. Not for the algorithm, but because there are people in your life who build things quietly, who hold principles that cost them, who do real work without needing the room to notice. And sometimes the most useful thing you can offer someone like that is a story that says, the original always outlasts the copy, even when the copy gets the credit. Follow the channel if you want to keep going. We're going to keep making these stories about the people behind the institutions, The names underneath the names, the rooms where the real decisions were made by people who are no longer in the room. And leave a comment, not a reaction, a thought. Tell me what landed. Tell me what you're still sitting with. And if there's a story you think belongs here, a company, a family, an empire, a name that's been forgotten, tell me that too. Because the next video might be the one you suggested. That's how this works. Slowly built on trust, the way Soul Price would have done it.